Hi everyone, my name is Daniel Moore, and this is my video defense of my project on Winston Churchill, his anti-Bolshevism, and the influence that had on the Cold War. I've been a history and government teacher for the last 6 years. My master's is in European history, and as of the conclusion of this class, I'll officially be beginning my dissertation in January on the combat effectiveness of the heavy tank battalions on the Eastern and Western Front from 1943 to 1945. So my interest in Cold War history has been a little uneven, to say the very least. I had a pretty decent working knowledge of the basic overview of it, but nothing that was too terribly specific. So on a side note, one of my, as that led into my interest in this is on my 2-hour commute on Monday to band practice. I started listening to a YouTube channel called The Great War, and they had a sidebar talking about Allied intervention. And I got to thinking, it was mentioning how Churchill was just violently anti-Bolshevik and Clemenceau in France was violently anti-Bolshevik. And, well, how does that connect? How is, Churchill, not being a leader in England, how does that influence his behavior once he does become prime minister and has to deal with Stalin? And were any of those old attitudes, did they carry over into his dealings with Stalin specifically, and toward the communist, the Iron Curtain speech is a good telling point on this, but the buffer zone that they created with the Warsaw Pact. So what my research analyzed was Churchill's position from 1917 until 1920, or early into 21, particularly as the Bolsheviks were beginning to push all of the white forces out. I had a substantial part of it was talking about the white failure to really have any sort of core, coherent ideology. They didn't really have a very focused policy or focused objectives. I talked about the nationalist movements, the emerging nations, specifically in the Baltic, Ukraine, Poland, and one of the other things that I mentioned was exactly what Churchill wanted to do once the revolution was in full swing. He was all about going in, boots on the ground. I think one of the speeches says it best. In 1947 or 49, I don't remember exactly which one, he mentioned that we had a real opportunity to have beat this problem, to met it head on. We could have strangled it in its cradle. And I think that pretty well sums up Churchill's long-term stance on Bolshevism. So the material that I used on this, there was pretty substantial dive into the archival material. The United States State Department has a very good record of the entire proceedings of the 1919 peace accord. I used memoirs from Denikin, from Rangel, Kerensky's speeches, Churchill's own speeches, Lloyd George's telegrams to various ambassadors from the differing nations after the Germans had been defeated. And so I took their opinions and what Lloyd George was saying behind closed doors to his other ministers, his ministers without portfolio even. Look, If we fight the Bolsheviks head on, it's just going to invite Bolshevism here. The people are not going to stand for any more warfare, no matter what the cause. And Churchill understood that, yes, it needed to be something the Russians did themselves, or why bother fighting it? But if they're going to be willing to stand up and fight it, then we have an obligation to go in there and stand up and fight it with them. Now, part of that could have been, that Churchill was very much an imperialist. He wanted to keep, sorry about that, school alarms are still going off. He wanted to keep the British Empire in its predominant place. And that was one of the arguments that Stalin eventually had used against him, is that, especially after the Iron Curtain speech, Churchill, and he kind of treated all the other nations around him, if they weren't English speaking, Central European Anglo, so to speak, then they really, Churchill kind of came across as like, well, maybe these nations need permission to set up on their own to do anything that's not in keeping with what the continental spirit is. With, maybe if we think outside the box, we're, going to get, draw the ire of the English, so to speak. So in hindsight, when we look at it, we can't necessarily say that Churchill was wrong, but what would have been the outcomes if Churchill had gotten his way? I think that's some of the interesting questions that are remaining, is if France and Britain had just gone in, would blood have ran in the streets in Paris like Clemenceau believed? And if economic support was such a big factor in beating back Bolshevism, well, then why did France hit Germany with such economic hardship, as Germany was already struggling, when they realized that Germany was sort of a buffer zone between the rest of Europe and Bolshevism? So that's my defense. I hope you guys have a great holiday, and if any of you are starting your dissertation in January, I wish you luck. Bye-bye.